Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Type A, Type B podcast, where we have conversations at the intersection of productivity and creativity. This is your guide for putting a process behind your creative career. So, let me just start this episode by saying that I am one of the most impulsive people you'll ever meet, both in my everyday life and in my career. I am known to act on ideas as soon as I have them. I go from first thought of an idea ever to spending money and hyper focusing for hours almost immediately. And sometimes that impulsivity has actually been a really great thing, helping me lean into that early momentum and kind of that creative juice that you get. Other times, it leads to a massive waste of time, money, energy, opportunity, all the bad things. And I've realized that this is a really common thing for creative people who really rely on so much of that creative momentum in those early stages. There was actually a study done that tested the impact on schedule autonomy. Basically, one group was told they have to complete one routine task before they can move on to a creative one, and the other group could switch back and forth between the tasks as they pleased. And they found that impulsive people are more creative when they can choose how to split their time between tasks, which means they don't have to limit their impulsivity. So it points to the fact that creative people tend to actually be more impulsive as a whole, and it does end up having a huge correlation to a creative process. So since this is something that is so common for creative people and kind of innate to creativity, I wanted to dig into this topic a little bit more, given the fact that there is a lot of good and a lot of bad. And I wanted to attempt to answer the question, is impulsivity good or bad for the creative process? So let's set the stage a little bit. I want to talk about some of the common perceptions that people have of impulsivity. The first is the more negative parts of it, where it's very chaotic and disruptive and flighty and just kind of going on intuition, not in a very good way. This is the more where you get the bad side of impulsivity. But that doesn't mean that there isn't also a positive side too. There is the spontaneity, the creativity, the positive risk taking that is also associated with this kind of flip side of impulsivity. And there's a lot of research to support both sides here. You know that I love to base a lot of what I'm talking in these episodes on kind of like this psychological perspective to see like if there is a proven good or bad or proven validity to something I'm talking about. And there is a lot on both sides. So it points to, spoiler, that there's really no right or wrong here. Impulsivity is a necessary part of the creative process, but it still needs to be controlled and leaned into in moments where it makes more sense and pulled back on other moments where it doesn't make as much sense. So let's talk about impulsivity when it comes to decision making. So there's this thing called the dual process theory that I think if you took any kind of psychology classes in high school or college, you've probably heard about this. And it's that there are two cognitive systems that have been identified for the way that we think through things. System one is the super, super fast impulsive thinking, and system two is the more slow reflective thinking. So here is one of the pros here where I think that this system of thinking where it aligns with impulsivity can be really good for your creative process. It can really help you overcome this analysis paralysis since it is so quick and just rapid, kind of taking out all, I don't want to say taking out all critical thinking of it, but taking out any overthinking. So it can help you to make quick decisions and respond and counteract this overthinking and perfectionism that you have when you're making a lot of decisions. It's kind of like ripping the Band-Aid off to just get started. So it can help you lean more in on your instinct and not get caught up in figuring out whether your idea is possible or not, which I think is often what leads to ideas getting super watered down and looking really different than what you were originally planning for. So it's really great for just kind of overcoming these initial hurdles or the hurdles of a sticking point. But it may not be the best decisions that you're making in some cases. So there was this 2005 study, so it's a little bit older, but I think our brains haven't really changed that much since then. And it showed that students from even like the top universities in the world struggled with simple problems when relying on these impulse responses rather than more of the like long-term reflective reasoning. So there has been a lot of studies that show that in addition to this one, that impulsivity is connected to a reduction in executive functions, which is like planning and cognitive flexibility. And these are two things that are really essential for long-term productivity. So while there are good things about this impulsive thinking where it can just help you get started, and like I said, ripping off a band-aid, in some cases, when there does need to be more deep thinking, this is at a proven disadvantage. So this points to the more of the benefit of impulsivity could be that starting momentum when you're just getting too bogged down in those decisions. And this can help you get unstuck and shift away from this more rigid thinking that might be holding you back. But it could be putting you at risk if you don't take the time at some point to do some deeper thinking. But let's shift back to another pro of impulsivity. And this is helping you get into flow state. So flow, I think that if you are interested in the concept of creativity, you've probably heard a lot about flow state. And this is one of the most critical things in the creative process. It's basically, how I think of it, is like the creative version of runner's high. Your intuition feels strong, you know what to do next, and everything seems to fall into place. And you get kind of this high almost where you're in the zone basically. And there are two key factors from like a neurological perspective that flow state requires. And the first is that you have to have a lot of experience and expertise in what you're trying to do so that you have a strong network of brain areas that help you actually generate good ideas for what you're trying to do. So that's kind of like the base level. And the second one is where impulsivity comes into play, and that is the release of control or letting go to allow this network to work with little or no conscious supervision. So this points to the fact that impulsivity isn't just helpful with getting into flow state, but it might actually be necessary. Like that is half of the necessary components to getting in flow, is just letting your mind kind of go where it needs to go. So now we're going to get back on the roller coaster and talk about some more of the downsides. I intentionally laid out this episode to feel kind of like a bit of whiplash and to make it super clear how impulsivity is truly so good and so bad for you at the same time. So if you're feeling a bit nauseous right now from whipping back and forth, that was intentional, because impulsivity is truly like two sides of the coin at the same time. So another con is that this leads to a lack of planning and structure when you're too impulsive in whatever you're trying to do. So this is where the type A side of me is really going to come out. I will preach till the day that I die that creativity can be a lot more fun and a lot more productive when you put some processes in place in the right places. You can tune into one of my very first episodes to learn more about this, where I'm talking about how to put a process behind your creativity. But constant impulsivity can be one of the worst things for this process, and it is one of your process's greatest enemies. It can really derail your long-term projects or goals by constantly shifting in directions. Sometimes these shifts can be good things because they put you on a better path, but blindly following your gut on too many things and not giving your process a chance to do its thing to help you kind of work through some of the kinks can be actually a very negative thing. That I think sometimes it is better to work through something bad than being like, I'm struggling here. And I think a lot of impulses can lead you to be like, oh, this is not working immediately, maybe I should shift. You can't always trust your impulse or your gut. So I think following it too blindly can be really, really bad for that process and will not let it do what you've created it to do. So this break-in process can not only have an impact on the end result, but it can also affect your collaboration with other people and your team dynamics if everyone isn't on the same wavelength. Let's say you have some people who are like, they are planners. They want to like lay out a certain process. And then there's other people who are just trying to constantly change things. I think that if you've ever worked in a group before, you've probably experienced this, where everyone works really, really hard to create a plan together, and there's one person who acts like those plans never worked. I think that's where you can end up not only sacrificing the work, but also sacrificing that relationship between the people on that team. So the chaos that impulsivity induces can also lead you to burn out more easily if you're constantly chasing new ideas without a plan. And I've talked about burnout on a couple episodes back, that a lot of burnout can be you're just trying to do too many things. And I think that impulsivity can often lead you to doing more work as a whole because you're having to go back and repeat things all the time. So it's a very big risk factor for burning out more easily. So now that we've gone through a lot of those pros and cons, and you can see that there is very, very clear value to being impulsive, but also clear risks to being impulsive, how do you make sure that you can take the good and the bad and make sure that you're being productively impulsive? So I have a couple of tips here. And like I said, I am a very, very impulsive person myself in all aspects of my life. So I've had to really learn how to temper this and know when to pull it out and when to push back on it. So I think the biggest thing is knowing when to be impulsive. And I think there's a few key places where it does make more sense. In places where it's more low stakes, it's not like you have an impending deadline and then you just choose to impulsively change the whole plan of what you're doing when you have to deliver next week and then you're going to stress everyone out. But if you're doing things like rapid prototyping, brainstorming, when you have the time and budget to really explore. So I'm a producer for a marketing agency, and often budget and time constraints make it totally impossible to be impulsive at all. But when there are projects with more flexible deliverables and a longer timeline, we're able to lean into more impulsive ideation for the beginning stages just to see how many different ideas we can come up with, and like just going for a numbers factor of how many ideas we can generate. So I think that in those cases, it makes more sense. Like if you're not going to be sacrificing the end result, or if you're doing something for a client, you're not sacrificing your relationship with them because you're constantly missing deadlines. If you have that time to play, then play. And that's often in the beginning stages. Another time when impulsivity might be good is if you're willing to introduce some risk into a project. Let's say that you want to be super innovative and you want to intentionally not overthink it. You want to be like, I want to go with my gut on this because I just want to see what's possible. I can see this happening a lot in music, where someone's creating a song and they just want to go with their gut and sit in a room and just see what happens, play around. Or maybe when you're sewing, that you sit down and you're like, I don't want to have a pattern. I'm just going to look at this fabric. I'm going to lay it on a mannequin. I'm going to see what happens. I think in these cases, you are like, maybe it is lower risk. Maybe this is just kind of a fun project that you're doing. Or maybe if you are making it for a certain person or a certain purpose, then you are able to like kind of be a little more experimental with it. And I think you also want to limit the amount of impulsivity. Allow yourself to have your moments, but make sure that there are other things that ground you around it. So I love the idea of soft structures where you can create plans, but make them flexible. So this means maybe creating space and time blocks for these impulsive ideas, but to help keep you on track. So let's say you have time blocks for spontaneous creativity, or you have a deadline for a decision before which you can play around and see where your mind leads you and switch up as much as possible. But by this date, I'm going to make a decision. So no more switching around after that. Another thing I think that is the biggest thing, that's the hardest thing if you're an impulsive person, but the pause technique. You know yourself, I know myself. Impulsivity can lead me astray sometimes. And there have been moments where I make the decision, let's say to do a total rebrand, and within minutes of that idea, I'm buying domains, I'm working on a new logo, I'm writing up a new website, I'm printing out new business cards, only to come to the realization a few days later that I don't actually want to do that. And that was an idea that I should have probably put some more thought into it. Once I've already invested a ton of time and money, that's when I'm coming to that realization. So sometimes all you really need is to just sit on the idea for a second. And whether that is just a 5-minute pause, sometimes that 5-minute pause is all you need to just like, not necessarily overthink it in that minute, but just sit with the idea and see like, okay, how could this maybe work out in the future? And you might realize, yeah, I'm comfortable still going through with that. Or you're like, no, that doesn't that's actually totally different than what I want to do. And like, just because it's an idea doesn't mean it's a good idea. That's what I'm always like constantly reminding myself. Or sometimes you have to give yourself a little bit more time, that maybe sleep on it to let some of that initial adrenaline run out. I know that having a new idea that feels really cool and shiny and new, like you actually get that adrenaline rush and it almost feels like a high. Sometimes just letting that go off like lets you approach the situation with more of a clearer mindset, that you're not being pulled by all of these chemicals going on in your body. And you can just look at the idea more practically. I think just using your gut on this is more helpful for these bigger, more impactful decisions, like taking this pause. But when it comes to other decisions where you feel like taking a pause is going to get you out of the flow, like I said, impulsivity is important for flow. So if you do take that pause, that could rip you out of that flow and get you out of like that good trajectory that you're on. So I think that you can kind of trust your gut in some situations and try to identify that your impulse seems like it's aligned with your goals. So it might be worth going through with it. For me, the moments where I really lean into that impulsivity is with something like having an idea for a podcast episode. I'll have an idea and then put it in my Notion system and then immediately get to jotting down all my notes, mapping out how the episode might work, researching, and that might lead me to other ideas for a video that I want to make, or a product that I want to create, or a course that I want to create. And if I have the time and energy, I like to lean into this. It's probably a more like manic feeling state, and I like to ride out that high and bust out a ton of this foundational work for these other ideas. Will I use some of these additional work that I did immediately or even at all? Maybe not, but you never know when it can come in handy, and that creative's high is worth it to me. So that is like the moments where I'm like, let me just like lean into it, and it's relatively low stakes if all of that does go to waste. So I know that a lot of this like impulsivity is like kind of making you sound like a junkie a little bit, but it kind of is like that. Like if runner's high, like they go for that runner's high, like this is what us as creatives go for. We want to feel this surge of ideas and adrenaline and everything. So I think it's attempting to cut all of that out isn't ultimately going to serve you well, trying to cut it out in all areas. It's just knowing when to lean into that, which hopefully this has helped you kind of realize those moments where it might be helpful. So, but this is again where I will make my warning about burnout. You can see how this can easily lead to burnout if left unchecked, because it is kind of like something of an addictive quality to it, that it can keep you just working and working and working and doing all these things and ultimately not leading to anything. So just be careful with it. That would be my warning there. So to summarize everything, to answer the question of whether impulsivity is good or bad, yes, both. It can be a super, super helpful tool, but only if you use it in the right way and at the right times. And like I said, and like the studies that I mentioned earlier, it is a normal thing. People who are more creative are more likely to be impulsive. So I think that trying to fight it completely is probably not going to be, it's not going to feel genuine to you. And it's going to be kind of probably useless because it's innately part of you. So I think it's just about like learning, recognizing it, knowing when you're being impulsive, and doing a gut check of like, is this productive impulsivity or is this unproductive? So I hope this was helpful. It definitely, in doing all this research, it made me feel better about my impulsive tendencies, but it also made me realize that like, you know what, there are some times when I think I can take a step back. So I think just having this, that's why I like to do so much of the psychology background to it, that like knowing, okay, this is the research that people have actually done on this. These are proven outcomes or techniques or something. So hopefully that's as helpful to you as it was to me. So thank you again so much for tuning in to this episode of the Type A Type B podcast, and I'll see you on the next episode.